and welcome back to From the Ground Up, a podcast from the UChicago School of Public Policy where we dive into the processes that turn minerals in the ground all across the world into green technology like solar panels and EV batteries. I am here today with Christian.
Howdy.
Logan.
Hello there.
And Rand.
Hey, everyone.
And today we're going to give you a deep dive into the beginning of this process. How do companies find mineral deposits, and how do they get to the point where they're able to start mining? First, though, why are we talking about this? What's the basic conundrum?
Thanks, Quinn. People need renewable assets to meet climate goals as a result of global warming. Renewable energy assets require minerals like lithium, cobalt, steel, aluminum, gold, silver, copper. For example, wind turbines require aggregate minerals and metals like concrete, steel, iron, aluminum, copper, zinc, etc. Solar panels require cadmium, gallium, germanium, indium, selenium, and tellurium. Mining companies dig these minerals out of the ground due to consumer demand for these products, but not limited to these products. But everyday technologies or products like, say, your house window or your smartphone or your computer require minerals.
Okay, so how do companies prepare to mine?
First, companies need to go out and find minerals. This phase is called the exploration phase. During the exploration phase, mining companies send out an exploration team consisting of geologists and engineers to try to find mineral deposits. If they think they found a mineral resource, the next step is figuring out exactly what they found. This phase is known as discovery. Experts will visit the site and drill out samples of the rock to be sent to a lab for tests to confirm the ore grade for consistency. If confirmed, the mineral resource evolves into a mineral reserve.
Okay, so what happens when they found something good?
Well, then the question becomes whether it's feasible to mine, and can a company come to an agreement with the community it's engaging with, and if it's even physically possible to mine in that region.
Let's say it is.
Then you have to design the mine. There are a lot of different types of mines. When you design a mine, you start with the ore body, and the mine is designed around that. Where the ore is, what type of mineral it is, etc. Mines can be surface or underground, and both types of mines can rely on different methods of extraction. Then you have to choose specific mining equipment. Typical equipment could be haul trucks, shovels, loaders, skid steers, heavy industrial equipment. And of course, the design of the mine takes into account the mine operators themselves, the conditions they might encounter, things that they might need to work safely, for example, a ventilation system that circulates air throughout the mine, specifically in underground, so that they have sufficient oxygen to survive.
Logan, what are your thoughts on this phase?
Aside from industry, communities offer an important third-person perspective on this whole exploration phase. As this all unfolds, the community is able to see it happen, but we're not quite at the stage where the companies need to engage with the community yet. What does this mean for residents? Well, often, without much information yet on what's going to happen, people are left to their imaginations. Some people, they may be enthusiastic and anticipate economic benefit for their community. We see this often with people who have large stakes in the local economy, like city officials and business owners. Many others may be concerned with the health and environmental ramifications of this potential mining. It's no secret that mining produces waste and pollution, and while this can be mitigated and made safer for the community, the industry does have an association with pollution. Because of this, richer neighborhoods often make it harder for miners to settle there, with many residents having what people call a NIMBY attitude, NIMBY standing for not in my backyard. This is part of the reason we generally see natural resource extraction, mineral extraction, all of the above take place in communities with less economic power, those often being predominantly of color and marginalized. Going back to the perspective of the community, you can understand during this exploration process why residents from these neighborhoods may feel especially nervous after decades of being let down by these same people.
After companies confirm they have a mineral deposit, one of the major next steps is making sure they have community buy-in. Why does industry need to engage with communities?
Mining, like any other profitable business, is in the business to make money. Not just anyone can mine, and mining firms are unique and specialized in their ability to do so. Consumers demand products, whether it's Apple, Google, Samsung, GM, Ford, semiconductors even, and those products need minerals to make them, and the mining companies supply them. Being overtly evil doesn't make money. It is in the interest of companies to be responsible and responsive to communities.
And this is where social license to operate comes in?
Yes, companies need an informal but very real social license to operate, or an SLO. An SLO is secured through various meetings with community leaders to negotiate a peaceful transition into the mining production phase where the communities get something in return to allow the firm to mine the deposit. Communities could negotiate for many things, from schools and infrastructure to developing industries within a firm. If a firm deems it feasible to do so, a deal is struck and the company can move into the mine planning phase. However, an SLO can always be revoked at any time by a community, and the mining company can't continue operating in the community without it. If a company doesn't keep their word and maintain a good reputation, then word will get around fast, and other potential projects or active projects could be halted in the process.
So who else needs to buy in?
Governments need to buy in as well. Companies need a formal permit to build and mine. Permits times vary depending on region. In the United States, mine permits can take at least 1.5 years to obtain, but longer times are common. Mining companies must maintain compliance with government regulations continuously throughout the life of the mine. However, there have been cases on occasion where governments have been lax in enforcing regulations and is later revealed as a result of a mine accident. For example, the Crandall Canyon mine accident or the Upper Big Branch mine. In both cases, violations were recorded and investigated, but the mine continued to operate without being shut down. Both mine accidents resulted in 38 deaths of both miners and mine rescuers. Just like how communities can revoke an SLO at any time, governments can withdraw support at any time as well. For example, there are some cases where governments have formally approved the development of a mine and once constructed seize the mine for the state by force. In those cases, mining companies must pick up and their leases and/or permits on the minerals will be expired.
Switching perspectives, what does this whole process look like and feel like for communities? Do communities see this the same way industry does?
Well, Quinn, the short answer is it's complicated. While there have certainly been success stories for communities negotiating with mining companies, what we often see is inequality of resources and leverage between mining companies and poor rural communities inside and outside of the United States. Many times, what people see is these companies come swooping in, promising to explode the local economy, and their town officials will buy into it before sufficient negotiations can happen to elevate community concerns, and sometimes residents are left out of the negotiations entirely. With that said, we're seeing more and more communities attempting to enforce certain standards of mining operations through the use of community development agreements, or CDAs. We're even seeing those CDAs in New York City, Los Angeles, and across the world from Aboriginal townships in Australia and Indigenous tribes in Canada. Outside of CDAs, organizations are working in this sphere too. The New Media Advocacy Project, for example, has been working for years to provide advocacy resources to poorer communities globally so that these communities can level the playing field of power imbalances in these mining negotiations. Some communities in the United States don't even get a say in mining settlements, particularly indigenous tribes with lands under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Mining companies often only need to obtain permits to begin operations, which oftentimes does not require input from the people actually living in these spaces. Potential progress in recent years has been made, but mostly only on the executive and judicial sides, where legislative policy, like real policy, should actually be. So, Quinn, going back to the original question on how the community sees the bargaining process, they do see it differently because they deal with it differently. The fact that we're seeing CDAs coming to fruition in the United States and across the world, advocacy organizations, and these complex policy problems, it shows how complex it can really get for these communities.
Rand, tell us a little bit more about the regulatory context.
Yes, and these issues of power dynamics, especially between mining companies and the communities in which they extract minerals, is complicated by a somewhat outdated federal infrastructure. Now, testimony from the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of the Interior last year provides a little bit of useful context. Most mining in America, especially on federal lands, is governed by the Mining Law of 1872, and originally, that granted the Department of the Interior full leeway to dispose of federal lands for extraction, but with no return for the taxpayer. No fees, no licenses, no leases that would have to go back to the American public in some way. Now, over time, this was reformed. And now, for example, if you extract oil or petroleum on public lands, you got to pay the government a fee. But under the 1872 law, and the parts that still remain in effect today, most minerals, including many industrial minerals, including metallic minerals, do not need to provide a return to the taxpayer. So what this means is that we talk a lot in our studies about transfers, about the effects of taxation, how they can be used to rectify any kind of inefficiencies, that harm that may occur. That doesn't really happen under the current infrastructure. So there's very little incentive for these companies to give back to these communities. And there's very little room for the government to provide support or transfers to these communities as a direct kind of function of the mines that are put in place there.
And what about the international context?
Well, Logan touched on it a little bit earlier, but mineral extraction forms the backbone of a lot of interconnected global supply chains. And as we've seen this year with the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act, it can be a national security issue as well as an economic issue. And so that makes international mining very fraught with tension between companies and countries, and also within countries too. For example, a recent study by Norman Loayza and Jamel Rigolini of the World Bank examined the impact of mining operations in the 1990s and 2000s in Peru, specifically on its impact on regions within the country. So they found that mining has a positive average but negative distributional effects on Peru's districts. In other words, the tide itself rises, but not everywhere equally. Mining projects in a district tend to make it richer, tend to increase consumption there, but it also produced inequality in the districts that they examined to a much greater degree than other non-affected districts. So this is partly due to migration of skilled, educated professionals who work in the mines from other areas, these possibly more rural areas. And it also demonstrates a lack of spillovers to neighboring districts, as they mentioned. This shows us that mining operations can exacerbate tensions both within countries and across countries. Another good example comes from Chinese investments in Ecuador over the past several years. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has a good write-up of this, where they describe relations between Chinese companies, national leaders, local leaders, and local populations. What they found in their case study was that some of these companies spend a lot of time and effort cultivating national elites and making them see the benefits of these new mining explorations on the country as a whole through increased revenues, exports, tax flows, and use these relationships to beat down opposition at the local level, particularly from indigenous populations. So these mining operations can pit policymakers at different levels of government against each other and against their constituents in service of wildly conflicting goals. And at the present moment, there's not a lot of coordination to make sure that everyone gets a slice of the pie.
What is everybody's key takeaway? What are you taking out of the room? And while you think on that, I'll go first. What strikes me is how many people are involved in deciding if and how mining will happen. A lot of the time, I know when I read about mining, it is in the context of mines that already exist. So it can feel like the mine was always going to be the way that it was, like it's inevitable. But what I'm hearing, listening to all of you, is that's not true. When a mine is being created, there's this period of 6 to 10 years where dozens of people, from geologists and engineers to community leaders to regulators, need to make really hard decisions that will influence the final outcome. Christian, what are you thinking about?
Imagine there was a QR code, similar to a nutrition label, as a potential pathway to influence companies to pursue more equitable and conscious mining methods. The information would provide the location of the minerals mined, to produce the product, and the methodologies used.
And this would be just like on all products?
Yes, this would be on every product that you see.
And what would you do with that information if you had it?
By having this information, consumers can be more conscious about where the minerals used in their products are mined from, the mining methods used, and the impact a firm had whether they mined consciously or unconsciously. If this information is available, it connects consumers to the mining companies like never before. It incentivizes companies to weigh the consequences of creating a product. Mining companies will be incentivized to behave more responsibly knowing that consumers are watching, and downstream companies will also be incentivized to behave more responsibly with a magnifying glass on how they conduct their business, interact with communities, and impact the environment. There is potential that demand will be impacted by these choices.
That is a really cool idea. Logan, what's on your mind?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking back to what Christian said earlier about how it's not necessarily profitable for companies to be overtly evil. And I think that's a really good point that sometimes gets overlooked in environmental justice. Myself, looking from an environmental justice lens, I see these spaces where there's a lack of policy, where we need to implement these CDAs, as I was saying earlier and whatnot. But when we don't have the policy, it is on the consumer to create a culture of accountability. When there is a lack of policy, this culture of accountability, consumers making the right choices, communities saying, we do want these mining companies, we don't want these mining companies. That is the leverage that these people need in order to protect themselves. So that's kind of what I'm taking away from today.
Yeah. Rand, take us home.
Yeah, before we started putting this together, I wasn't really aware of the whole concept of a social license to operate, like kind of a social contract, obviously, between a community and an operator. I've been thinking a lot about how this plays into the institutions that we see in policymaking, incentives that different actors face, and how it plays out in our daily lives. Mining, especially for high-value materials that make chips or solar panels or whatnot, it's quite literally extractive endeavor. And great challenge that we have before us is to make sure that we're not extracting value from these communities, particularly vulnerable communities across the world, but without giving anything back in return. We have to make sure it's a fair trade.
Yeah, that seems to be a thread that a lot of us are thinking about today. And I would love for us to do a future episode where we just really dive into how to make that possible and how specifically consumers can try to make the best choices they have with the information that's available. That's all for today. Thank you for joining us on From the Ground Up.